All right, we're on. I'm joined today by Calvin Robinson. Calvin, thanks so much for joining me. I've been really excited about this opportunity to spend some time with you. I've followed your story the past few years and have really been an admirer from afar. And I just to the audience, I reached out to Calvin over social media, and you were kind enough to respond back, and I invited you to hop on here, and you said absolutely. And the reason why I reached out is because I felt like we have really similar paths in our development, our age. We're both around 40 years old. We both have theological training at the formal level. And we both have unique experiences when it comes to free speech and taking a stand in our own lives on free speech. And Calvin, you're very known for having done that and for being a man who's lived by your convictions. Just personally, I saw a huge tide turn for you in regard to the Oxford Union experience that you had. And I felt like that was kind of a watershed moment in your career. Maybe you have different opinions on that, but I feel like that was a place where people really understood who Calvin Robinson was and what you stood for. And so I just would love to kind of dive into that some more during this time. But yeah, just to kind of start us off, I was wondering, how old were you when you sensed a call to be ordained in ministry? I'm curious.
That was in my 20s. When I left industry and entered education, and my whole life changed at that point when I became a teacher. It was a shift away from worldly things into a more vocational life, into seeking fulfillment and contentment over earthly reward. And once that paradigm has shifted, it enabled me to properly seek Christ. And once I'd discovered Christ in the Eucharist, I realized that my entire life had to be centered around the Eucharist. And from then onwards, really, it has been. I served in church for a number of years. I joined the parish council, the PCC, or out here they call it the vestry, heavily involved in my parish. And then eventually I realized that it wasn't enough to be involved. I had to dedicate my entire life to this, and sought or discerned and prayed through a vocation to the Holy Orders.
Yeah. It's a big commitment, right? It really changes the whole trajectory of your life. Were you around, like, you said your early 20s, about 21?
I genuinely don't know what age, but in my 20s. I was older than 21 because I was still in the industry at 21. I was working in technology in the last year of university, and straight out of university, I worked for a technology company.
Yeah, I only asked because I was 21. Like, for some reason, 21 seems to be an age that a lot of people become Christians. I wonder if it's because you kind of dip your toes into the world a bit, and you're like, gosh, I don't really know if I want to be going that route. 21 is like a magic age where you kind of like maybe sober up to those things, and you realize that there's a whole lot more.
Well, it's a developmental stage, isn't it? Like, I don't think I became a Christian at 21, but I became a man at 21. I put away the hoodie and the tracksuit bottoms, or the jeans or whatever, the t-shirts, and started wearing a suit every day, even though it wasn't required of me. I figured there has to be a coming of age process. There has to be a decision when you decide to be a man, because our society no longer requests it of you. And I had a bit of a mindset change at that point, for sure.
That's an interesting take. Yeah, I feel like the in today's standard, it's not so much an expectation that you become an adult. It's kind of like maybe wishful thinking that eventually, once you get past not just undergraduate, but graduate school, and then you're, fully independent as a 35-year-old or something like that. I recently heard someone talk about adulthood being, a time when you are fully accountable to yourself and your actions. And that could be when you're 15. That could be when you're 40, Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. And I feel like when we were in our early to mid 20s or so, is a much different time socially than now. I can even point to a year where part of my own experience was I was in academia at a really critical time I did my seminary studies at a school called Dallas Theological Seminary, which is kind of like a flagship evangelical school. And loved my time there. Went there from 2008 to 2012, graduated, worked a bit for 2 or so years. And then I went into PhD studies at Catholic University here in Washington, D.C. And that was a time, like the early 2010s, I felt like was a big shift culturally on university campuses. I know here in the U.S. it was. There were, you had like things like the Me Too movement happening. You had the Ferguson, Missouri riots. You had all these points of friction developing involving gender, transgenderism. Queer studies became like everyone started talking about that on campuses, and I really sensed a big tide shift, such that I was actually while in my graduate studies, really questioning, like, do I really want to go this route? Because I'm seeing people become professors and it's like 60% of their time is being spent in diversity workshops. Right. And I was just curious, have you had the same sort of observation that was like a real shift culturally?
No, 2010, where was I? Leaving university, working in technology, design development, having a great time, having lots of fun. Relatively small office that made a large impact on the industry, made a bit of money. I was playing video games in my spare time and partying, and I genuinely can't remember anything woke. I don't think I knew about woke in 2010. I was not that politically engaged back then.
Yeah. But I mean, in recent years, you've been known as someone that's taken a very firm stance on things like the traditional view of marriage, a traditional view of sexual ethics. Yeah. Maintaining traditional biblical standards when it comes to who should be qualified for ministry. What was that experience like? Going from your prior.
Yeah, well, I would have still had conservative views, but I would have been more liberal in the mindset of, that's what I believe, but everyone else can believe whatever they believe. I would have been kind of like, well, you do that and you do that, because this is before I was strong in my faith, so I didn't really have a structure to base right and wrong around. It was just, well, surely everyone has their own opinion on right and wrong. You have to find an objective, universal truth before you can be anchored in it. But yeah, absolutely. Once I discover the faith, it was like, well, this makes sense. This is clear. It's God has given us in his order what is good and what is evil, and we're to strive towards goodness. We're trying to become saints, and we're to avoid evil, which would prevent ourselves from sinning as best we can. And when we sin, we have to repent of it and not live in it, not embrace it. And the world around us doesn't see that worldview anymore. But it's no one's fault. It's just we've drifted away from it, so we have to re-engage with it and bring it back to the forefront. I think that's happening more lately than it was perhaps 10 or 20 or 10, 15 years ago. But it's about recentering our entire perspective.
Yeah. And so, I mean, obviously you've had some run-ins with people within the Church of England and other branches where that you're trying to be faithful, right? And you're trying to uphold your convictions and live by them. What was it like being in formal ministry and trying to be productive and fruitful, and having people say, like, did people basically say, hey, I know that that's what the Bible says, but we don't really talk about that here, what was that conversation like?
I was very fortunate because I came up in the church through a bubble, right? So I was in the Anglo-Catholic bubble in England, a member of the Church of England. And we had the soundest churches, the most beautiful churches with priests who adhere to the Catholic faith. And everything was wonderful. It was hunky-dory. So that's where I was serving, and that's where I was formed and catechized. And that's where I went to seminary. I went to the best seminary in the country, if not the best Anglican seminary in the world. And that was all wonderful until that came to an end. And it's like, okay, now I have to go out into the real world. And actually, the church is as worldly as the rest of the world. It's kind of like, so what do you do about this? Do you compromise from day one? or do you stand firm and potentially not go forward? And, I reached the end of my training. I completed my course in seminary, and I was supposed to be sent out to a church in London. And I was being sent out to an Anglo-Catholic church with an Anglo-Catholic priest and an Anglo-Catholic bishop. However, the person ultimately responsible was the Bishop of London, who is now going to be installed as the Archbishop of Canterbury. And she's liberal, she's woke, she's hardly Christian. She's certainly not Catholic in her theology, otherwise she wouldn't be a priestess. So she wasn't my bishop, because I don't believe in the ordination of women. However, there's an arm of the Church of England, being in the ACNA, there's an arm of traditionalists who they make a space for them. But she ultimately had responsibility over London, and her and I did not see eye to eye. When we got on, we had pleasant conversations, but my faith is not her faith. Her faith is not my faith. That became very clear very quickly, and I couldn't serve under her jurisdiction, and she didn't want me serving under her jurisdiction. So we parted ways, and I thought that was perhaps the end of my ministry. I thought, okay, so I've done all this training, discernment, prayer, and the Lord's led me here, and then it's all over in the blink of an eye. What's going on? But of course, other pathways opened, and I was introduced to the GAFCON movement, which you're a part of, and I had no idea there was Anglicanism outside of the Church of England. I genuinely had no idea. It's not on our radar in England. In England, the perspective of Anglicanism is that it's synonymous with the Church of England, and that has pros and cons. But obviously that through the British Empire, we spread the English expression of the Catholic faith, which we call Anglicanism, all around the world, and partly to America, partly to the African continent. And all of this I was exploring at the time, and it turned out there was a path to remain on my ministerial track where I was in England for a time. And so God opened that door for me as he closed the other one.
Yeah. It's really hard when you feel like you've been led to something divinely, and you're trying to be obedient, and you follow it, and it doesn't work out. And it kind of reminds me of the passage in Acts where I think it's Paul and Barnabas. They're both godly men. They're both led by the Holy Spirit. They have a disagreement and they part ways.
Right.
And like God led them to that. It's interesting how these work out in like actual life decision making, right?
Yeah, you can see throughout the whole book of Acts, God is shaping their paths. When they want to go to certain places, he says, no, you're not going there. So they want to go somewhere else. He says, no, you're not going there. God's like, you're going to Macedonia. It's like he has a path for us all in mind. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. We have to be obedient and try our best to follow it. But when it comes up with surprises, it's going to take us in our stead, isn't it?
Yeah. Can I tell you about my own experience with that? I get into this PhD program at Catholic University, and I really wanted to go into academia because I had a very shaping experience as an undergraduate student here in the U.S. And I became a Christian through a campus ministry called Campus Crusade for Christ, just called CRU for short. Didn't really grow. I grew up in a household with great parents, but I didn't have any exposure to the gospel or anything resembling Christianity at all. Just total blank slate, right? Or as much as possible. And, I became a Christian in undergrad, had a very shaping experience, and I really wanted to be in that context as professor. I also, I'm a brain. I love doing research. I love reading. I love, scholarship in general. But also, I had an experience as a teenager. My dad's office was blown up in the Pentagon on 9/11. And, he's survived and he's okay, but was obviously deeply
impacted. Probably lead with that.
But psychologically and emotionally, that has an effect on you as a man. Right. And, but growing up, I was deeply aware of what was happening with, I guess what Huntington would say is a clash of civilizations. And, that shaped me very much to the point where, as a seminary student, I became very interested in asking the question, well, what happens if I take the same biblical tools that I'm learning about in like historical Jesus studies, textual criticism, historical critical hermeneutic, and apply it to the Quran and Islam? And interesting things happen when you explore that, because you realize that there's a much different sense of what meaning and tradition means in that context, and what integrity of manuscripts when it comes to the Quran text and things like that. I got into that more and eventually accepted at Catholic University. And they encouraged me to explore that, like all of these areas, until I started publishing and landing journal articles. And one of the journal articles I landed was in, are you familiar with the academic publisher Brill, Brill?
No.
It's a high tier academic journal. But basically I landed an article in that, and my advisor, who, here in the States, your PhD advisor is like your mentor, but much more than that. It's like they determine the outcome of your life, kind of in a human sense. He basically said, I can't even get published in that outlet. Why did you think you could get published in that? And you actually did get published. I'm angry, And he was really bothered because what I was basically saying was the text of the Quran seems to be including very much, not so much canonical gospel material, but apocryphal gospel material from the Proto-Evangelium of James, in terms of the infancy narratives and the lineage and origin of Mary and such. And so I was making a case in this article that it seems to be drawing from an apocryphal tradition, and that drew instant critique against me. Among other faculty, no one really wanted to associate with me. They called me an Orientalist. In the there was a famous book in the 80s called Orientalism by a guy named Edward Said, and basically he said Westerners can't critique Middle Eastern context because it's colonialist and it's Orientalism. So I became kind of ostracized quite a bit because of something that I published, and it was very clear that I had to make that decision of I'm not going to have a fruitful experience here, but everything I've invested myself here, I feel like in the media, it's all for naught. But over time, God showed me that there was so much more that He had planned through that, and so I feel like we have similar experiences there, but maybe different contexts. So,
yeah, that's tough. That's very tough.
Yeah. But from there, I mean, how do you go from being, an aspiring priest to standing before the entire Oxford Union and talking about your convictions and being open to that's a place where I'm sure like the rubber really meets the road with what you truly believe and standing up for it and kind of giving an account for all of that. It's not the most it's a pretty intimidating environment for a lot of people, I'd imagine.
So I've been outspoken since around 2012, 2014. I was partaking in localist activism, just trying to improve my area, part of the local what do they call them? Neighborhood committee, just trying to get things improved where I lived. And through that, I realized that actually you had to do more because there were so many bottlenecks and this bureaucracy everywhere. And so I ended up standing for election. And while I was standing for election, I was talking publicly about the issues that I saw around me. And one of them that I talked quite a bit about was education, because education was, again, this is pre-woke, but it was going woke, right? Education was going liberal, and young people being indoctrinated with all kinds of fluff. And I started writing about it, and this got picked up in the local papers, and from there it got picked up in the tabloids, and from there it got picked up in the broadsheets. And before I knew it, I was writing regularly for the Daily Telegraph and the Daily Mail. And so because I was writing in the papers, I got invited onto radio stations. Because I was invited onto radio stations, I got invited onto television. Because I was on television, I got invited to debates. And so I was used to these panels and debates, and used to just sharing the truth as best I could, as I understand it, as the church teaches it, on a range of issues. Throughout COVID, trying to fight for freedoms, throughout George Floyd, trying to fight against Black Lives Matter in favor of all lives mattering. And so when I got to the Oxford Union, on one hand, it was just another debate, right? On the other hand, it was important because it was against three bishops. So it was against the establishment. It was against the church. And And I was a newly ordained deacon at the time, so I didn't think it was my place. And I tried to encourage them to get other people involved, and they tried. They invited every Catholic bishop in the country. None of them accepted. So it became my responsibility. But I didn't. I mean, it was a big deal. Of course it was, but I didn't realize how big a deal it was. I was just like, okay, I think I'd done Cambridge and Durham at that point as well, or around that time anyway. So I'd done all the big three. And I just carried on. So afterwards, after I lost that debate, I wasn't very happy, but I carried on writing and speaking and debating, and that's what I did. I didn't realize that it'd been a watershed moment, as you called it, or anything like that until months and months later. Maybe until the next time I came to the States, actually. Because out here in the States, that's what people know me for. And I'm like, oh, okay, wow, I just thought it's an Oxford thing. I don't think people out here would be taking much notice of it, but millions of people around the world have seen it. And it's been astonishing to me. I'm glad that I was able to lend a voice to the truth and to the Christian teachings. Like, very little of it was me. It was all the scriptures. It was all the catechism. It was all the Book of Common Prayer, which is great. It needs to be heard by people. But at the time and in the place, it wasn't groundbreaking for me. I didn't think I did particularly well.
Mm-hmm. Well, I felt like what really stuck with you, and I think it's so cool because you gave Saint Athanasius a moment, and your reference to him at the end saying, "If the world is against the truth, then I'm against the world."
Oh yeah, and
that was such a beautiful way to end that. And I'm glad that you gave that man a moment here in the modern stage. So. But like I feel like here in the States, people hear the name Oxford, and they associate that with a standard of scholarship and intellectual excellence, and I think when they associate someone who is taking a principled stance as a clergyman in a context like that, I mean, I think people like Steve Bannon have spoke there, Nancy Pelosi have spoke there, Ronald Reagan spoke there. I mean, they have people who are big names, and so I think that here, at least here in the States, we give a lot of credibility to that institution, and so,
yeah, which is fair. But I just don't. I was invited back there this Christmas, and I rejected. I rejected the invitation. So those words are words to live by. So we're called to be in the world, but not of the world. And if the world is against the truth, then we should be against the world. And at the moment, I don't think the Oxford Union is a place worth spending our time. When I see what's coming out of there, it's a great shame that it's being, when Charlie Kirk died, that was a milestone moment for the whole world, for the whole Western world. And to see their president celebrating that's just demonic. It's evil.
Yeah.
And I couldn't have anything to do with them.
Yeah. Understandable. Did any of the students who were there, did they press any questions that really stood out to you, or because I'm not sure if the recording that's available online captured some of the student feedback?
So I don't know if it is, but they certainly were. They had floor speeches nonstop, pillying me, hurling ad hominems at me, criticizing my character, my performance, never the content, because they can't challenge the truth. But yeah, the attacks were plentiful. It wasn't a pleasant experience. I didn't invite any friends along. I just turned up. There were a few people in the audience that I recognized, which was nice, but we were massively in the minority. I just thought I'd go do it and then get back to my life. And I wish I had taken some friends along. It would have been nice to have some moral support, because it was just a very toxic, hostile, vitriolic environment. But that's what you can expect from these liberal institutions these days. The Oxford Union one was quite. At least they listened as I was speaking for the most part. Very few interruptions. Cambridge was very different. Cambridge, you could see their demons being agitated. They couldn't sit still. They couldn't physically tolerate what I had to say. It was fascinating.
Fascinating. Wow, that's wild. So that was we used the word watershed moment for you, and in recent years, that was 2 or 3 years ago or so. And so, there's been some time in between. You're now in the U.S. Is that right?
That is. I'm in Grand Rapids, West Michigan, as we speak.
Nice. In nice sunny Grand Rapids.
I had to put my Wellington boots on to get from the rectory to the church. It's very snowy out here.
Yeah. What's been your experience like here in the States in regards to, you're talking about like seeing this rise of woke influences on education and society, and like it's concerning when you're actually observing it in your own home situation, because you remember a time when it wasn't like that. But here in the States, we've had plenty of dose of that. That I can see. But do you see, being in the U.S. environment, a different expression of that, or a reduction of it compared to the U.K.?
Yeah, I love it here. People are fighters in America. They are frontiers, right? So they are passionate about freedom and about Christ for the most part. So people push back against a lot of stuff that you would never see happen in the UK. Like Britain has and I love my homeland, don't get me wrong, but Britain has an environment of politeness that America doesn't have. Right? America is big, brash, and uncouth. But I like that because it means that people are more open, people are more honest, people are more truthful. In Britain, we're more reserved. It's just our nature. And that means that the lies get to fester, because the lies, the vocal minority speak up, and that's all everyone ever hears. People who are on the side of truth tend to be quiet, bury their heads in the sand, because they don't want to rock the boat. Unfortunately, that has to change if we want to survive. But in America, that isn't the case. People push back against woke. People push back against evil as far as they see it. And for the most part in America, people are celebrated for speaking the truth. People are celebrated for celebrating their free speech. And I say for the most part because there are some blind spots out here. Israel is a major blind spot in America right now. Touch that subject, you'll find out how much of a taboo it is, which is very similar to how Islam was in England 10 years ago, but now Islam has taken over England, unfortunately. But it's very dangerous to have certain topics that you're not allowed anywhere near, especially in a place that supposedly celebrates the idea of all topics being open, because we're a land founded on free speech.
Yeah. I think I wish this were. I'm not sure if this isn't known widely, or if it's just not appreciated widely here in the U.S. But traditionally we view our free expression as not something that's bestowed to us by the government, but rather it's a natural right. It's something that's given to us by God, and part of just the natural fabric of the how nature operates, right? And I feel like there's a misunderstanding of that here in the States, that there's people kind of seem to imply that it's the government's job to give us the right to free speech, and it's actually the government's right to ensure that that right is there for all people. So I feel like people like free speech, but then when it really comes down to it, they don't recognize where that right actually comes from. And I think that leads to other willingness to concede on certain things when it comes to speech, because they don't realize that it's theirs. I think James Madison said that you have a right to your property, and you have property in your rights. Your rights as a person are your property, and I feel like things would be much different, or even better, and when it comes to free speech in our country, if people embrace the idea that their freedom of speech is their property that they can build their life on.
Yeah, our rights come from God. Our rights aren't given by a government, and so they shouldn't be able to be taken away by a government. A government's job is to protect our rights, absolutely. People are so confused today; they don't know what rights are. We have the right to life because God gives us life, and God takes life away. And the liberal argument would be, well, no, every single human right is government dictated. Therefore, a woman has a right to choose whether to kill her offspring or not, for example. And you use the analogy of free speech. Absolutely, free speech is not given to us by any man. We have the right to free speech so that we can proclaim the gospel at all times in all places, and that's a God-given right. And so, yeah, it's about understanding where these things come from. People seem to think that anything they like or want is a human right. Things that we need, food, water, labor, all these things that we need to do, what makes them a right? People don't even question it. It's just I want that, or I like that, or I need that, therefore it must be a right. This is where communism comes from, the idea that we can take what other people have because we have a right to it. Of course we don't. The right to property is founded in the Ten Commandments. There's 2 commandments.
With the right to life, that's obviously a huge subject in Christian circles today, and especially within Anglican conversations. I'm part of a communion that values life and wants to advocate for a traditional view of that. How has that been, in a UK context, advocating for that? Like, do you feel like that's shifting in an encouraging direction, or are you discouraged by what you see there?
Yeah, so it's always been an American conversation, and I think that used to be the dividing line in the country. Like, so people who were pro-life were clearly the conservatives, the people that were pro-death were clearly the liberals. That dividing line has changed. The line in this country has changed, and actually a lot of that again comes back to the Israel conversation. Now you can see a left and right spin going on there. However, in Britain, it was never about the right to life. We had both Israel and Islam as our dividing factors of conservatives and liberalism, but which meant that whenever you wanted to bring up the topic of life, you'd hear things like, "Oh, we don't want to go like the Americans," right? So it's seen as something that's too extreme for general conversation. If you look at our parliamentarians, you'll struggle to find a handful of them that are openly pro-life. So our politicians haven't embraced that, but there has been a shift in the dialogue of the people most recently. So people who call themselves conservatives have started to wake up to the fact that you cannot be conservative in a Christian country without being Christian, like protecting the Christian faith, tradition, heritage, values. And that means that you cannot be conservative, really and truly, without being pro-life. And a lot of them have woken up to that fact. The March for Life that I went to a year ago, just before moving out here, was the biggest March for Life we've ever had in the UK. 10,000 people turned up in London. Now that's great for us.
Yeah.
As you know, the March for Life where you are in DC, there'll be over 1 million people there. So it's very, very different. Are you going to the March for Life in January?
Yes. Yeah, I will definitely be there. Yeah. Will you be there?
If I can find a way to be there, I'll be there.
Oh, cool. Yeah. If you're in DC, let me know. Yeah.
I went this year. It was outstanding to see that the vice president made it his first public appearance in person at the March for Life. That's outstanding. And to see the president give a video message, like we wouldn't see this in England. It's just not. It's not possible to imagine it.
Yeah. It's really interesting because, like, in ministry context, I feel like the right to life is very much that's an example of how your theology, if you're consistent with your theology, it will, no matter what, impact your socio-political views. And I just can't imagine being a confessing Christian and saying, yeah, I affirm everything in the Bible. I follow Christ. He dictates my life, but I believe in, but I'm a pro-choice supporter. To me, that's inevitable, not just error, but full-on heresy. Because if you're affirming a pro-choice position, you're saying at some point, probably in your argumentation, that there's a point in a child's development where he's not human. He's just a clump of cells. And if you apply that to Christ, you're basically saying there's a point where Christ was in his mother's womb and he was just a lump of cells.
Right. I don't think anyone genuinely believes that we're just a lump of cells or clump of cells. Like, of course, we all are, quite literally. But I don't think anyone does believe that. I think it's just something that they can put forward so they don't have to think it through. You're quite right that we believe that Jesus Christ is fully good and fully man, and always was and always will be. And the fact that when he was in his mother's womb, he was fully God and yet fully man. And so to deny that at some point that he was fully man denies the very being, the very essence of Jesus Christ. It denies God. And so by saying that at some point in the womb we're not quite human is denying. It's an anti-Christ mentality. But of course it goes further than that. It always goes back to this is the fruit of the devil, because Christ in the most blessed sacrament of the altar teaches us that we consume his body for life. And through the words, when the priest is acting in the person of Christ at the sacrifice, the priest says, "This is my body." And that's the words of Jesus Christ in John 6. and the enemy flips those around. And when the woman decides, actually, so where Jesus wants to give life, the woman decides she wants to end life, because this is what the enemy wants to do. Those exact words are what she uses. It's my choice because this is my body. And of course, we know it's not the truth, but it's an inversion of good design, of God's order. Therefore it's demonic. It is the sacrament of Satan, quite literally.
Yeah, I agree.
The moment that body, the mother and the father conceive a child together, that body is created, and God, through his spark of light, as we hear in John 6, introduces a new soul into the world. That's a sacrament that both husband and wife, both mother and father, are co-producing with our Lord. Like, it's partaking in divine majesty. That's marvelous. But of course, the enemy can't create, and so all the enemy can do is destroy. Right. This is where God gives life, and God creates a miracle with the parents. The enemy, the devil, does the opposite and sacrifices a miracle.
It's like every virtuous and good thing that we're speaking of here, in terms of the introduction of new life, and even marriage. There's always this common theme of creating something out of nothing, and only God can do that, right? But you're totally right. That all Satan can do is kill and destroy, and create nothing beautiful.
Yeah, the enemy can create nothing out of something, but God can create something out of nothing.
That's right. Yeah. Just going in a different direction. Here in the States, I feel like it's not as understood. I wonder, it could just be because we're, the broad evangelical scene is very much impacted by, I think, Continental Reformation history. A lot of Presbyterians in this country, a lot of Reformed Baptists, a lot of people who, Luther, I get it. Calvin, I get it. But English Reformation is not as much of a category, I feel like, in American Christian thought. I'm not trying to be critical of anyone in particular. This is my observation the past 20 years or so. Yeah. And, I'm always interested in this because I feel like something very different happened in the English Reformation relative to the Continental Reformation, or at least on the European continent, where, like the English Reformation, the goal wasn't to just completely divorce from Roman Catholicism. I think the saying is, plucking the weeds from the garden. You're trying to get back to what really matters when it comes to Catholic identity, right? And I was just wondering if you could go into more, just for our audience that might be a new thing, that you can be Anglican but also have a Catholic identity. That whole Anglo-Catholic route might be new for people. Can you describe what that's like?
Yeah, of course. So there was one church. Christ instituted one church, but through our fallen nature, we tend to splinter and split, and we disagree with each other. And then, so there was the Orientals broke off, and then there was the Great Schism. And then for another 500 years or so, the church managed to do okay. Actually, it thrived. And then so the enemy doesn't like that. The enemy doesn't like when the church is thriving. So then came along the Protestant Reformation, the European Reformation, which was supposed to be about reforming the church, about ridding it of error and potentially of heresy, although there can't ever be heresy within the church, but there can certainly be error. But the Reformation didn't work. It failed. It didn't rid the church of error. All it did is made people leave the church. People were either excommunicated or they left the church, which is apostatizing, which is never a good thing for our souls. And so the Protestant Reformation it produced bad fruit. The English Reformation was slightly different in that it wasn't an attempt to reform the church. It was a jurisdictional issue, and people ignore the nuance because they like to see the world in black and white, especially history is always black and white, but there was plenty of nuance around the time. And the kings of Europe selected their bishops for the most part. The Bishop of Rome didn't used to select the bishops, every single bishop, as an example. But then he started to accrue that power. After the end of the Roman Empire, there was a power vacuum, and the papacy stepped into that vacuum and wanted more authority than he'd had for the last 1,000 years or more. And part of that decision was electing all the new bishops. And England had an issue with that. We've always had an issue with foreign governance, always. There were problems from the very beginning when Roman Catholics first came to England and tried to unite the Celts from like Iona, Lindisfarne, as well as the people from what is now known as Wales and Wessex and Sussex and places that are now known as England. To unite them all was difficult, but to unite them with a foreign rule was incredibly difficult. And so we've always had that problem. We had Brexit recently where we just said, no, we don't want it. And so there was some of that. So there was some resentment towards the continent. And there was also the issue of King Henry VIII needed an heir. He wasn't granted an annulment for a political reason, not a theological reason. The Pope had given annulments out to similar people for similar reasons, but Charlemagne was the Holy Roman Emperor at the time, and his relationship with King Henry VIII's wife, being his aunt, meant that the Roman Emperor put pressure on the Pope not to allow the annulment. We can all see those family dynamics. We can all see the power dynamics. We can all see the politics. It makes clear sense if you look at it holistically, but people like to make it a theological thing where it wasn't. And so he said, well, therefore, we're going to divorce ourselves of the jurisdiction of Rome. He didn't say we're going to stop being Catholic. He didn't say we're going to throw away our theology. In fact, prior to this, he'd been awarded the title Defender of the Faith by the Pope because he was such an ardent Catholic defender. He argued against Martin Luther. And so people who think that the English Reformation was a part of the Protestant Reformation of Europe are clearly wrong. King Henry VIII was one of the most theologically strong Catholics we've had in any position of governance or power. It's very rare for a king to be a strong theologian. And this man was a published theologian. So when he said to the Pope, look, we're going to divorce ourselves of your jurisdiction, he meant for the bishops to continue their apostolic succession. He meant for the church in England, which was the Catholic Church, to continue as it was, but without the Pope having a final say over everything. Of course, that's problematic, and that doesn't work in the Catholic Church. Of course it doesn't, but it wasn't a case of you've got error in this theology, error in that theology. It was a case of jurisdiction or jurisprudence. And the king wrote or published the 10 articles and the 6 articles, which are both, people should look them up, incredibly sound. Now, of course, once you've taken away an authority, you have to put an authority in place. And that meant that the King of England was the authority of the Catholic Church in England, which is problematic because once Henry VIII left, it was up to his children. And this is where things get messy because Mary I brings the church back in line with the Catholic Church. Fantastic. Elizabeth I takes it back out again and makes it even more Protestant. Not so good. But then there has to be a way to bring everyone back together. Oh, of course, I almost forgot King Edward, his younger son, who was like, 11 years old, manipulated by Thomas Cranmer, and into introducing more Calvinism and a bit of Lutheranism into the church in England, which was never the plan and should never have happened. And so, Protestantism crept in because there was no authority, or there was localized authority. And so eventually Queen Elizabeth I had to try and bring everyone back together because we had a divided country of people who thought they were still Catholic within the church in England, people who thought they were Protestants within the church in England, and people who maintained their Catholicism in line with Rome, but had to do so on the down low. And in fact, she killed them for it quite often. And so she had to find a way to try to bring people back together. And that was what we now refer to as the Book of Common Prayer, quite literally common prayer, that every church across the country was forced to take on. It's a beautiful book with beautiful liturgy. Thankfully, it's very Catholic in its theology and its practice and its tradition, but it was in the vernacular, which was new at the time. Prior to the liturgical reforms of the 1960s, of course, at Vatican II, the Western Church was in Latin. And so the first real prayers in English came out of the English Reformation. But this Book of Common Prayer maintained much of Sarum use, which was the main liturgical use in England at the time. There used to be the York use, which got suppressed, and the Sarum use from Salisbury became the biggest, which was the traditional Latin Mass before the traditional Latin Mass. The traditional Latin Mass was standardized around this time, around the time of the English Reformation. And so what people see now as the age-old tradition is the age-old tradition, but it had different flavors, and our flavor in England was Sarum. Now, Sarum got maintained through the Book of Common Prayer, which is a beautiful treasure to behold, because much of the European continent, through the standardization of the TLM, lost their flavors. So whilst the traditional Latin Mass is a great beauty that every church should celebrate, there are, of course, slight flavors different traditions to that traditional Latin Mass. And in England in particular, we've held onto it thankfully, through the Anglican expression of the church. And this is why Anglicanism is just the English expression of the Catholic faith. It's not no one set out to create a new denomination, and it certainly wasn't supposed to have a new confession. It was just Catholicism in England without being oppressed by a pope in Rome. That was the idea behind it.
Yeah. What are your impressions of, I think it was John Henry Newman who wrote on, I think he had a major work that was huge importance on the Via Media, the middle way, and I think his conclusion was the Via Media is a great ideal, but in order for me to actually fully carry this out in my life, there have to be significant structural changes within the Anglican Church as it is, which is what drove him back to the Roman Catholic branch, right? Is that correct? I mean, that's my assumption from reading and interacting with it a long time ago.
Yeah, St. John Henry Newman wrote a lot of good stuff. So did his contemporaries around that time. I think Edward Pusey is underrated, very good theologian, and John Keeble, and people like that. I am a big fan of Vernon Staley in particular. Vernon Staley has a book called The Catholic Religion, where he wrote the Anglican history of the church in England, and it is fantastically laid out. But I think the problem is that a Via Media cannot work. You cannot have a middle way between Protestantism and Catholicism long term, because Protestantism is always shifting. It becomes more and more liberal as you go on, because it's founded on a principle of no authority at all. So where the church in England took authority from Rome and gave it to the king, that went away with Elizabeth. She isn't. So the king of England is no longer the head of the Church of England. He's just a governor. He's a supreme governor, has no authority. And so there is no real authority in the Church of England, which means they can do what they like, which is why they promoted abortion, they promoted divorce, they promoted remarriage, they promoted contraception, they've promoted priestesses, they promoted same-sex marriage. Of course, all these things are anti-Christian, but they can do it because there's no authority. And really and truly, if they have no authority, they should not be able to change anything unilaterally without an ecumenical council, without the greater church coming together. But because they're no longer aligned with Catholicism truly, they do what they like. And that's why it will fall apart. It will disappear. It's the beautiful tradition out of England will be held onto, hopefully. But the denomination of the Church of England will be dead very soon. It's been in managed decline for a long time. It won't survive much longer. I don't even know if it will survive in our lifetimes, to be honest with you. But of course, the Church of England has more safeguards than most Protestant denominations, in that most of them, every single person is his own pope. And this is what Martin Luther did. Martin Luther made a pope of every man. This is why Karl Marx loved Martin Luther, because he saw the works that he'd done and said, I want to do this on a secular level too. Basically, he wants to make a king of every man, how Luther made a pope of every man. And we can't function that way. Hyper-individualism is just as bad as hyper-collectivism. Like, we can't have 5 people around a table all having different interpretations of the scriptures, just as we can't have 5 people around the table having different interpretations of the law of the land any more than God's law. It does not work. We can't function that way. And so there has to be a united authority. There has to be a central authority. And so that's why eventually everything will come back together. We're seeing the East and the West talking a lot more in recent years than they have in a long, long time. If the West and the Eastern lungs of the church could reunite, that could change the very future of the church.
Well, I sent you that video clip online about Leo calling for amending of East and West, and to have someone like him so vocal about that and so clearly say that's big. What I want to point out something that you said earlier about the problem with the Protestant approach is you have eventually people kind of choosing their own ways, and it becomes innumerable in that. It's funny too how you saw this especially in Puritan communities where they're leaving environments where there's a very strict tradition, and they are moving geographically to pretty much a wilderness to express themselves purely Puritans. But in that process, it's almost like they create their own traditions because what would happen, if you spoke against the interpretations in these small communities, well, like Roger Smith showed us, that you get kicked out. You get sent to basically Rhode Island, right? And it's interesting how there's this phenomenon of, we are the liberal free thinkers separating from the status quo that we feel like is imposed on us. But then when we go to a new place, we are creating our own status quo. It's kind of like what's happened with the left. Remember, 40 years ago when people who were liberal were, that free thinking crowd, and then now the people who call themselves liberal are like that tradition has shifted quite a bit, right? And they've almost created their own tradition that they go by. So there's almost like an orthodoxy that they're trying to maintain, and they in turn kind of become conservatives. They're trying to conserve their interpretation of the world and what's true. So curious, could you share with the audience a really important work or a series of work that has really shaped you? Doesn't have to be faith-based or anything like that, but I thought I read somewhere that there was like a certain science fiction series that impacted you.
Yeah, that's a good question. C.S. Lewis's Ransom series is fantastic. I was trying to get more into science fiction again this last year or so because I don't really take much downtime, and so I wanted to have a form of escapism, I suppose, or just something that could actually force me to take some time out for recreation. And so I chose C.S. Lewis because he's one of my favorite writers, great author of Christian works, and he has a science fiction series called the Ransom Trilogy, and it's amazing. It's set in Earth, maybe 50 years or so ago, but it's about how would we interact if we discover there are other planets, not just Earth, that have life and that God has created and that he's set out his plan, and what would it look like if his plan wasn't corrupted on a planet? So we see a new Eve as an example. And the third book,
that's interesting. I've never read that series before. So
you absolutely should. Yeah. The third book is the darkest of the three, because it's about the veil between the spiritual realm and the world falling apart, and so it's about evil in and on Earth that is pernicious through big business, big science. It's very, you read it, you'll recognize that we're actually living in that world, and that evil is very mundane, very boring, very minuscule. Evil isn't like the big, like villainous scheme with a half goat man with great big horns who's red in skin color. Evil is like the monotonous and the small lies that grow. And it's a fantastic series. I recommend it to anyone.
Interesting. It's just amazing that, first of all, C.S. Lewis, his ability to write in so many different styles, and Screwtape Letters to Narnia series, just amazing. And the man was a trained medievalist, and maybe that kind of helped inform some of the really wild and creative ideas that came about in medieval literature. Maybe that really kind of impacted him as a writer.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. So thanks. That's really helpful. It makes me want to check that out. So, well, I appreciate you joining me today. A lot of other things you'd be doing right now, but it means a lot that you join me here for an hour and talk about this. Last closing thought for anyone who, let's say there's a 21-year-old out there who has aspirations to be maybe a ministry leader or kick up dust in this world and do something productive and good. Like what would you tell that person?
Get rooted in the scriptures, go to the best seminary money can buy, be formed and trained and catechized in the faith so that it can be your anchor, and make the truth be your focus in all things. Never get distracted by worldly reward or prestige, because they are a distraction, and the enemy will tempt you. The enemy will try and trip you up. The enemy will try and silence you, but stand firm in the faith. Proclaim the name of our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ at all opportunities, and all will be good.
Yeah. Amen. I agree with that. reminds me of something I tell people who are younger. I said, you'll never regret taking a risk for Jesus. Like you're never going to regret that in your life. So really, really appreciate your time, Calvin. And if you're ever in the DC area, just reach out to me. We'd love to kind of be your host around here and hang out, especially if you're going to March for Life event here. So
wonderful. Thank you, Jonny. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Calvin. All right, take care. Thank you.